Okay, welcome to the beginning of week 2, our recorded lectures. Your first chapter that you're going over today is the 1920s, which was a pretty big deal for the United States. We ended last week by conquering World War I, and as I mentioned before, World War I really launches the United States onto the international stage, and it changes a lot about what's going on in America. And so the 1920s is this very important moment in history. And we often refer to the 1920s as the Roaring 1920s. You see reflected right here. But there's another side to the 1920s. There's both sides, the roaring and the reactionary side. The roaring refers to exciting, new, modern, developing, pushing forward. And the reactionary is sort of moving backward, trying to become more traditional, trying to hold on to things of the past and slow down, quote unquote, progress. So it's sometimes difficult to understand how both of these things can exist within one decade, but we're going to look at that today to see how we can have a 1920s that's reflected in this picture and a 1920s that's reflected in this picture here. So remember to look at your ID terms as always. Now that you've taken the first exam, you know a little bit more about how those ID terms work. So make sure that you're taking note of those. We're starting here with the Roaring 1920s. As we move from World War I into the 1920s, we have this redevelopment of big business. If you remember, during the Progressive Era, we really toned down business a little bit through regulation as we tried to make things more fair between the worker and the employer. But now we're going to have this return to big business. We're going to forget progressivism. We're going to return to this laissez-faire ideology, which basically says that the government needs to stay out of how business is progressing and let the economy regulate itself. We also are in a situation where the American economy is the lone survivor of World War I, and we're going to be in a position to really influence Europe through economic means. Because we have this boom of business, we're going to develop this consumer culture during the 1920s. The consumer culture is one in which people are in the habit of consuming in excess. They're buying the next new product. They're purchasing all of these different things they don't necessarily need, but they want, that are available to them. We live in a consumer culture today where we're buying new phones or new TVs or new technology products. And that's just part of our culture, this idea of consuming. There's a lot of new products on the market for people to consume. Theirs would be not so much cell phones as things like dishwashers. And if you've never had a dishwasher before in the 1920s, you can understand why that would be pretty exciting. With this consumer culture comes this idea of mass culture and standardization. Basically, everybody's consuming the same products. You have the development of the department store like Macy's here in the 1920s, where everybody's shopping for the same things at the same places, and they're beginning to standardize the things that they buy instead of buying from local markets or local stores where everything would be very individualized. One of the things that this consumer culture does is it creates the need to produce psychologically generated desire. What that means is that now people have the opportunity to buy things that they don't necessarily need and that they want instead. So companies have to start convincing people or persuading people that they do need or want these things enough to be willing to spend money on them. And that's when we get an increase in advertisement. If you look at this picture right here, this Scott's emulsion picture, this is an example of an advertisement from the 1890s. It's basically just black and white words explaining why you need this cough medicine. It's not difficult to convince somebody that they need a cough medicine. If they are coughing a lot, they probably are going to want to buy something for that. So there was no effort here to try to sell the product, but rather to just inform about the product and what it did. Here in the 1920s, we see a radical change in how we advertise. We're using stars like Babe Ruth to tell you why Red Rock soda is going to be the best soda that you could ever drink. We have a woman, sex appeal here, explaining that women need silk stockings in order to look like her. The words are fewer, the colors are brighter, it catches your eye, it makes you want to look at it, it's more attractive. And here in the 1920s, one of the most roaring aspects is that it's generating this desire for advertisement that's going to lay the foundation of our modern world. And everywhere you go in the 1920s, suddenly there are these images everywhere selling these new, exciting, big products. Because we have this consumer culture with new products on the market, this psychologically generated desire, we're going to immediately see an increase in credit usage. People all around the United States begin to buy things on credit, which was something that they never did before the 1920s. Because to buy on credit meant that you were in debt to somebody. It meant that you were not economically free because you were beholden to another person. And that was anti-American, according to the U.S. prior to 1920. But in the 1920s, we actually switch this mentality, and it becomes American to buy on credit because that's how you achieve or afford the American way of life, buying all of these big, fancy things. And so that also sets the stage for our modern world. We also have the development of leisure in the Roaring 20s. Sports, music, and movies become very popular. People are going out to see Babe Ruth. They're going to the movies, which would still be silent movies. And they're all developing fandoms for these silent movie stars, like this woman here, who was one of the biggest stars in the 1920s, but you probably know this face more. This is Charlie Chaplin, who was one of the biggest male stars of the 1920s. This is a good time to go ahead and pause this lecture and go back to Module 2 and look for that clip of the silent movie, The Modern Times, that I have put up for you to get an idea of what silent movies look like and a little bit about what big business looked like as well, since Modern Times is about factory work. So picking back up with our lecture, continuing our discussion of the Roaring 20s, we also have two groups of people who experienced the 1920s in a roaring way very specifically. And the first is women. After women get the right to vote in 1920, they're going to continue to push for additional rights in the form of the ERA. And the ERA here is an amendment that says the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What the Equal Rights Amendment basically said was that there could be no difference between male and female under the law. And a lot of women advocated for this, and they would be part of this new woman movement in the 1920s. They advocated for this as the way to achieve true equality. And a lot of women also disagreed with it because what that meant was that women could be drafted. There was no provision for maternity leave if there's no difference under the law between men and women. And so there were a lot of women who opposed it as well, but it becomes a big part of the political discussion in the 1920s as women try to fight for additional rights. The other component of the new woman is the flapper, pictured here. These women that you see standing next to this man, they look very different from the women that you would see prior to 1920s. They're wearing shorter skirts. You can see right here, these women have skirts above their knee, and that would have been very scandalous. They also have shorter hair. They go out dancing, they go out drinking, they work and make their own money in the factories. They have a political voice. And so these women would be called flappers, and it was part of the new women's movement in the 1920s. It's part of modern, exciting new developments. So when you talk about the new woman, you would need to include the ERA, the political side of it, and the cultural side of the flappers. Black Americans are another group that experienced the 1920s in a particularly roaring way, at least to some degree. This movement that we're going to talk about is called the New Negro Movement. It's what it was named at the time. And it also has a political and cultural component. The political component of the New Negro Movement is based on this guy right here, Marcus Garvey. He developed something called Garveyism, which was the idea that Black Americans were never going to be accepted or fit in the United States, and so they needed to return to Africa where they could develop a country of their own, where they could achieve self-determination through returning to Africa. To promote this idea, he formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which worked to better the rights of African Americans as a whole, but also to promote this idea of a return to Africa. He also promoted the idea of self-consciousness, which didn't mean to be insecure, but to be conscious of oneself, of where one came from, of what one's culture was, and who and where this person was going, to be self-conscious. So, like the ERA, this movement, this political movement, doesn't really take off in the 1920s, but it's a big part of the discussion and the culture at the time. The cultural component of the New Negro movement is known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that produced a lot of art, literature, theater, and dance from the Black community, particularly from the New York neighborhood of Harlem, where a lot of Black Americans had ended up during World War I as they migrated out of the South. Once free from some of the oppression in the South, they begin to produce a lot of art and literature and dance and music. And what is so significant about this, what makes it so roaring, is that a lot of this literature, theater, dance, art, it becomes mainstream. So it's the first blending of white culture and Black culture that we see here in the 1920s. And so because of big business, because of these new products, because of what women are doing and what African Americans are doing, all of those reasons add up to a very new, exciting, different, modern 1920s. But at the same time, we have a lot of reactionary components to the 1920s. For instance, we have the Red Scare in the 1920s, which is a fear of communist influence. During World War I, Russia becomes communist, and we're afraid that because we were allies with them, because we see a lot of Russian immigrants in the United States, that we will be influenced by communism as well. And so that puts a very negative spin on the strike wave that's moving through the United States in 1919 and 1920. These are workers who are advocating for their rights, but just as workers often have been, they're associated with communism and therefore targeted by the Red Scare. And so a man named General A. Mitchell Palmer will launch a series of Palmer raids against these immigrants who are conducting these strikes, trying to get more rights for workers. He will raid their homes. This will end up in about 5,000 arrests and hundreds of deportations. And what this essentially does is it ends the labor movement because of fear. And so we see that this is a reactionary component of the 1920s because we're trying to go back to a pre-progressive era, trying to go back before workers were advocating their rights, before we had this threat of communism, and hold on to our tradition, to a time that we're more familiar with. Fundamentalism is a big part of the reactionary part of the 1920s. Religion gains a lot of power, a lot of popularity during the 1920s, particularly fundamentalist religion, which is going to be an ultra strict or an ultra intense version of evangelicalism. These evangelical Protestants who were fundamentalists, they disliked the modernism of the roaring 1920s. They didn't like the influence of immigrant religion. They didn't like the influence of science that they felt was questioning religion, like evolution. And they interpreted the Bible entirely literally. Every word in the Bible was to be considered literal. And so while you might think that these religious fundamentalists would have influence only in certain areas, perhaps the South or the rural areas, they actually have influence all over the country. And they do a lot to sway Americans toward the reactionary side, trying to hold on to a pre-modern version of the United States, one that is rooted in tradition and conservatism. One example of just how influential these fundamentalists were comes from 1925 in Tennessee. It's called the Scopes Trial. So the Scopes Trial begins when a man named John Scopes is teaching in Tennessee, and he decides that he disagrees with Tennessee's law that evolution cannot be taught in the classroom. And so he begins to teach evolution purposefully in his classroom. He is fired for this, and he will then take his case to the state Supreme Court, hoping that in the course of his case, they will overturn the law that says you can't teach evolution in the classroom. And so this is his goal. He hires a very good lawyer, very good reputation. That lawyer's name is Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow will go to bat to defend John Scopes in this trial. Now, it becomes a trial that's much more about evolution versus creation than anything that John Scopes did or said. And so it's Clarence Darrow trying to break down the validity of the biblical creation story. And so he calls a witness named William Jennings Bryan, who is a spokesman for Christian fundamentalism. And he begins to question him about the Bible. And in the midst of that questioning, William Jennings Bryan says that it's possible that the 7 days of creation were actually 7 eras of creation, and that the term day is just a metaphor or a more generic term that doesn't actually literally mean 24 hours. So he says this, and Clarence Darrow believes that he has William Jennings Bryan in the exact spot he wants him because fundamentalists say the Bible should be interpreted exactly literally. But now William Jennings Bryan is saying that, well, maybe it isn't exactly literal. And so Clarence Darrow feels as though he has won this trial with that fact alone. And this becomes a battle to the death between Bible and science. But emphasizing the influence of fundamentalism and the strength of the reactionary thought in the 1920s, the jury still comes back and rules against the right to teach evolution in the classroom, not because of how the trial had gone, but because of their predisposed commitment to fundamentalism. Closely related to fundamentalism is the idea of prohibition, which is the banning of alcohol. This was a fundamentalist movement. It gained a lot of popularity during the 1920s, and it did actually pass. This prohibition passed and was in effect from 1920 to 1933. And a lot of the reasons were religious, that people believed that it was non-religious or immoral to drink an excessive amount of alcohol. There were also practical reasons. Many women were for prohibition because their husbands were often drunk, and that led to a lot of problems at home. And so there was a great fundamentalist or reactionary movement to try to remove alcohol from society. And it does succeed when prohibition passes. It succeeds in cutting alcohol consumption in half. So it does have an impact. But those roaring flappers, those new women, they are still doing a lot of drinking in the cities where they would develop things like speakeasies, which were hidden away saloons where people could still go to drink. Another example of the reactionary 1920s is the development of the KKK. KKK actually began in 1865, developed into a very violent organization throughout the 1890s, but then had kind of died off in activity up until 1915. And then from 1915 to 1925, we see this resurgence in the KKK as they begin to actively work against minorities. This new version of the KKK is not just targeting Black Americans, but immigrants, new women, anything that's modern. They basically want to return the United States to its pre-1920s era. And so they're working hard to do that. The difference, or another difference in the KKK this time around, is that people actually hold respectable positions in society and are part of the KKK. See, in this picture, you can tell that they've stopped covering their faces with these hoods because it became respectable, or at least acceptable, to be part of the KKK. They actually begin to campaign for politicians and control political parties throughout the United States, even in the North. In Illinois, for instance, they control the Republican Party in the North. The final reactionary component that I want to talk about is immigration restriction. If you remember, during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, we have about 1 million immigrants coming into the United States every year. And people are very concerned that this is changing the United States, that we're allowing communist influence, Catholic influence, Jewish influence to come in, and it's having a detrimental effect on America. And so our fear has now outweighed our need for cheap labor. And so in the 1920s, we passed the National Origins Act, which limits immigration to 150,000 people per year. So instead of 1 million, we're now taking about 15% of that in every year. So a lot of people are denied entry based on this new National Origins Act. It's even more restrictive, though, because there are quotas for each nation. And nations that we like, that we approve of, like Britain and France, they have much larger quotas than places like Russia or any Eastern European country or Italy or places like that where we think that the immigrants are less desirable. So this applies to our immigration, and it severely restricts who can come into the United States. However, this did not limit immigration from the Western Hemisphere. In the West of the United States, we still have a lot of Mexican immigrants coming in because there is still a huge demand for labor in the West. This act also barred all of Asia, except for the Philippines, who were still part of the United States. We could not bar them from coming in, but it bars all Asian immigrants in the 1920s. And again, this is a reaction to our fears, it's a reaction to our concern over changes, and we're attempting to secure a more traditional America. So all of these things take place in the 1920s. Everything that we just discussed is happening at the same time. And how you experience the 1920s really depends on where you are and who you are. If you are a woman living in New York, or an African American living in New York or some other big city like Chicago, then you're going to be experiencing more of the roaring 1920s, the excitement, the newness, the modernization, the freedom. If you are in the South, if you're in the rural areas, if you're poorer, you are more likely to be on the reactionary side. And so this decade, although we mostly remember it for its flash and dance and excitement, is actually very intensely a reactionary decade as well. Now, you can make the argument that either one of these is more influential. You would just have to pick your evidence accordingly, and you may at some point be asked to do that. So make sure that you really review this material thoroughly when you are studying for the exam. And when you're ready, we'll move on to the Great Depression.